everyone, this is Rick, and I wanted to thank you for joining me on another INWYT walkabout. I am in Sedona today, taking a little reprieve from the northeast winter. It's 70 degrees, sunny, and there are beautiful views in the neighborhood where we're staying, no matter where you look. I'll give you a little shot over here in a sec. Let me just get in position here. Beautiful mountains. I wanted to spend a little bit of time today building on what we were talking about last week with regard to conflict and how division and all of its subcomponents really create conditions for the frustration and really the inability to solve functional problems that sit beneath. And I want to share an example with you that highlights not only that, but also how the approaches that we take to solve problems, solve conflicts, actually is the application of conflict to try to solve them, and how ineffective that actually is. So I'll take you to my surgical intern days a long time ago, where I was working at a VA hospital, had a lot of patients, and one of the expectations for interns was always to collect all of the patient information that reflected activities for the day and to have that ready for presentation to senior residents and attendings in the late afternoon so that we could plan next steps. And one of the big challenges with getting that information was labs. It was always a painful process to order the labs, and the turnaround from the time they were drawn to actually being able to record them took hours, and it was always a last minute scramble to get the information that was needed for rounds. And there was very high expectations to get that done. So we got to a point at the hospital, and it wasn't unique to the VA hospital where I was, where the inefficiencies got to a point where it was just nonstop complaining by the house staff, me, the interns, the attendings, care teams, that something was just grossly inefficient with the way this was being done, and the lab needed to come up with some kind of an alternative solution. And so under that kind of pressure, the lab kind of took a look at things and said, all right, why don't we create an expedited process for patients who really need their labs urgently? And we'll call that STAT. So if you have a patient that needs labs with a very quick turnaround, order it STAT, and we will put that to the front of the line and make sure that you get those results when needed. So, all of us kind of said, well, I don't know that that's going to solve our bigger problem, but at least it's a start. And so we were pretty good, I think, at the beginning to try to identify those patients that really did need their labs urgently over the course of the workday so that we could, adjust care and make correct decisions. But, what ultimately started to happen was that while the STAT labs got a little bit faster, the non-STAT labs, the regular labs, actually got much more inefficient and took more time. And it got to a point where, as an intern and my fellow interns basically started to realize that, this is making things even worse, and this isn't going to work for us. And so what we started to do is we just started to order STAT lab for everybody. Our rationale was, I need my labs by the afternoon and it's urgent, so we'll call it STAT. And, ultimately, again, maybe it was a little bit quicker at the beginning, but when everybody does it and it becomes the standard way of ordering labs, is basically it got as inefficient as where we were to begin with. And, before you know it, the level of frustration and ability to do anything more effectively was gone. And on top of that, now when patients really needed urgent labs, you couldn't indicate the urgency on the lab request anymore, because you couldn't say, no, this one is really stat, the other ones aren't. This one is really stat, please do this. And what happened at the end was that we would have to actually draw the labs ourselves, run them down to the lab, and talk to the lab technician and say, please run this now. And you can imagine the inefficiency that added to our day, as well as to the inefficiency of the lab process itself. So it just became an incredible mess. And, with everybody doing it, we got to a point where you didn't even know what the problem was anymore to begin with. And there really was just a total loss of understanding on top of, what was probably ineffective understanding to begin with. So, what's the point of all this? Well, again, you can see how the problem with the process, the functional process of lab draws, had its own set of elements that needed to be looked at, and for which nobody took the time or had the time to look at, and where the frustration levels and sort of the expectations of care teams and the predisposition to blame the labs, if things had a negative impact on patient outcomes, pushed them to have to make a quick fix, their own workaround, where they basically said, we don't understand the process as a whole, but maybe we can divide out a patient group and, try to allay the frustration at least a little bit, and, maybe that will help. And, it worked for a time, but as I described, ultimately the lack of understanding and the ineffectiveness of that for the overall process for the labs that everybody needed led people to get frustrated and to create their own workarounds. I created the workaround. I'm not going to order stat labs for patients who really need it. All my patients really need it because I need them by 4 p.m., by the afternoon. So I need to get them done. And when everybody does that, when everybody creates a workaround, you get what is called suboptimization, which, many of you know, but, it's making a personalized individual improvement at the expense of others. And when everybody is doing that, it becomes just a colossal mess, as I described. And there really becomes a total loss of any functional process, let alone an understanding of what actually is going on. And you get to a point where either the system collapses completely and somebody just basically says, we need to take a pause and take this thing apart. But we don't know where to start, and there's always an urgency. You can't stop labs. And so somebody always comes in, a leader or somebody who's in charge, and says, here's what I think is going on, and here's what we're going to do. I'm going to fix this once and for all. And again, it's based on lack of understanding, and you just keep perpetuating the complexity in the system so that it just becomes an endless spiral. So, this is one small example in healthcare. This is just labs. Healthcare is complex, and you can imagine how more complicated processes have sort of the same type of approach that just makes the mess worse and worse. And you can look in, our daily lives, look at politics, look at, religious conflicts, how, we start out by trying to solve things with some sort of division or some sort of fragmented improvement that creates the next level of frustration and the next episode of here's what I think is going on and here's what I think we should do, which just, again, is driven by frustration and conflict and subjectivity that ultimately never gets to what the core problem is, and we don't even know what it is anymore. So think about that, and think about, in your daily lives again, how we create workarounds for everything that we do, pretty much. When something's not working and we get frustrated, we take charge and we do something about it. And it's usually based on frustration or what's in it for us, what's in it for me. And one example that you might look at that I always see on a weekly basis, because I travel a lot, is managing baggage when you're flying, and all of the frustration and the workarounds and the self-centered moves that take place to get your rollerboard into very limited overhead baggage space. And think about how in that instance, there are all these incentives that airlines put into place to try to get customer loyalty and get business that always have some sort of a baggage component associated with it, and for which it actually makes things worse. And so when you're traveling, it's one of the most frustrating things is getting on the plane, because everybody is trying to get that space, that coveted space. So that's it for today. We'll continue to look at how conflict shows up, not only in creating problems, but also how we're applying it to attempt to solve problems. And ultimately, we're going to get to a point where we go, all right, so what do we actually do about this? But for now, let's keep looking, because a lot of it is very much invisible. So I hope all of you have a wonderful day, a great week, and I will leave you with one more view of Sedona before I sign off here. Another beautiful view of a mountain in the backdrop. This is Rick with INWYT Walkabout. I'll see you next time. Take care.